Your window's halfway down, he's already leaning toward you before it stops moving, and the question comes out smooth, almost bored, like he's asked it 1,000 times because he has. Where you headed tonight? Simple. Casual. Nothing about it should feel dangerous. And that's exactly the problem. Because that question, or one just like it, is the single most common doorway good, honest, law-abiding people walk through on their way to a night they never should have had. Not because they did anything wrong, because they answered before they thought. Here's the promise of this video. I'm going to show you the one thing you need to do before you answer any question an officer asks you during a stop. Not after the stop starts, not after you've already been talking for 2 minutes, but before a single word about your life, your trip, or your business leaves your mouth. Skip this step, and it doesn't matter how innocent you are. Do this step and you take almost all of the power out of that question before it ever gets asked. And stick around, because near the end I'm going to walk you through the exact moment where skipping this one step turns an ordinary Tuesday night stop into a search of your entire vehicle, and how one sentence, said at the right time, shuts that door permanently. Before we go further, if you want to actually know what to do the next time blue lights show up behind you instead of guessing and hoping for the best, hit subscribe now, because this channel exists to hand you exactly that, one real scenario at a time. Quick disclaimer, this is legal education and commentary, not legal advice for your specific situation. Laws shift a little state to state, but the core principle I'm about to give you holds up almost everywhere in this country. Let's get into it. So here's the one thing. Before you answer a single question beyond confirming who you are, you invoke your right to remain silent, out loud, clearly, in your own words, before you say anything else. Not silence, not just clamming up and hoping the officer reads your mind. You say it. And I want to explain exactly why saying it matters so much, because this is the part almost nobody gets right, and it's the difference between a right that actually protects you and a right that quietly does nothing at all. Here's the thing about staying quiet without announcing it. Courts have wrestled with situations where a person simply stopped talking during questioning, without ever clearly stating they were invoking their right to silence, and that unexplained silence was later used against them, treated almost like evidence of guilt rather than the exercise of a constitutional right. Think about how backwards that feels for a second. The right exists, it's real, it's yours, and yet if you just quietly clam up without saying so, a prosecutor can sometimes stand in front of a jury later and ask them to wonder why you went quiet right at that moment. That's not a loophole in the law being used against you unfairly. That's simply how the right has been interpreted, and it's exactly why the smartest, safest move isn't silence alone. It's silence you've actually claimed out loud, on the record, in words that can't be misread later. So here's the sentence, and I want you to actually say it out loud right now, wherever you're watching this, so it's not foreign to you the first time you need it for real. Officer, I'm going to remain silent, and I want to speak to a lawyer. That's the whole sentence. 10 words. Say it calm, say it once. Say it with the same tone you'd use to ask someone to pass the salt. Not defiant, not scared, just stated, plainly, like a fact about the weather. That single sentence does more legal work for you than almost anything else you could possibly say during the entire encounter, and I'm going to spend the rest of this video showing you exactly why, and exactly how to use it at every stage of a stop, because knowing the sentence isn't enough if you don't know when it applies and when it doesn't. Let's slow all the way down and walk through what actually happens, second by second, when those lights come on behind you, because the timing of everything matters more than people realize. First, the pullover itself. Signal. Move to the shoulder calmly, put the car in park, turn on your interior light if it's dark out, and put your hands on the wheel where they're visible. This isn't about being submissive. This is about controlling the one variable that actually determines how tense the next few minutes get, which is how much uncertainty the officer feels walking up to your window. An officer who can see your hands, who sees no sudden movement, who watches you sit calmly and wait, that officer's guard comes down. An officer who sees fumbling, reaching, movement toward the glove box or under the seat before he's even reached your window, that officer's guard goes up hard, and once it's up, everything that follows gets harder for you. So before anything else happens, you've already made your first move, and it cost you nothing. Hands visible, calm posture, engine off, window coming down. Now he's at your window. And here's where the one thing we talked about starts to matter, because the very first thing most officers do isn't a demand, it's a question, wrapped in friendliness. Evening. Know why I stopped you tonight? Or, where you coming from? Or even just, how's it going tonight? Everything okay? These sound like small talk. They are not small talk. They are the opening moves of a scripted process, and the officer asking them is trained specifically to get you talking before you've had a second to think, because a relaxed, chatty person hands over material a guarded person never would. This is the exact moment where the one thing this video is built around needs to happen. Not eventually, not after a few rounds of friendly back and forth, but right here, at the very start, before you answer anything beyond confirming your identity. Here's how it actually sounds in practice, because I don't want you walking away with a vague idea, I want you walking away with the exact words. Officer says, "Evening, sir. Do you know why I pulled you over?" You say calmly, "Good evening, officer. Before I answer any questions, I want to say that I'm going to remain silent, and I'd like to speak to an attorney. Here's my license and registration." That's it. You've been completely respectful. You've handed over the one thing the law actually requires, your identification, and your documents if you're driving. And you've drawn the line clearly in your own words, before a single detail about your evening has left your mouth. Now I know what some of you are thinking, because it's the same thing almost everyone thinks the first time they hear this. Won't that make me look guilty? Won't invoking my rights right out of the gate make the officer suspicious of me? I want to be completely honest with you about this, because it's the single biggest misconception standing between people and actually protecting themselves. Declining to answer questions is not evidence of guilt, and it cannot lawfully be treated as evidence of guilt once you've clearly invoked the right. The instinct that makes people talk anyway. I've got nothing to hide, so why would I need a lawyer? That would make me look bad. That instinct is not wisdom, it's a vulnerability, and it's one that officers are trained, whether they think of it in these exact terms or not, to rely on. The honest, decent people are the ones who talk the most, because they genuinely believe cooperation and honesty will protect them, and most of the time it doesn't hurt them. But some of the time, enough of the time that this matters, it's exactly how an entirely innocent person ends up handing over the one detail, the one inconsistency, the one offhand comment that turns a routine stop into something much worse. You do not need to have done anything wrong for this to apply to you. This is not a tool for guilty people. It's a tool for anyone who understands that answering questions under pressure, with no time to think and no lawyer in the room, is simply not a smart move, regardless of what actually happened. Let's talk about what this sentence actually protects you from, because I want you to understand the mechanics, not just the words. The first thing it stops is the confession trap. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" is engineered, whether the officer thinks of it this way consciously or not, to get you guessing, and guessing means admitting. You say, "I think I might have been going a little fast," and congratulations, you've just created a recorded, on-the-record admission of guilt that didn't exist 30 seconds earlier, straight from your own mouth, easy to write into a report, easy to use later. Once you've invoked your right to remain silent up front, that trap simply doesn't work anymore, because you're not there to answer it. The second thing it stops is the fishing expedition. The "where are you headed? Where are you coming from? Whose car is this? Who's that with you?" round of questions that feels like conversation, but is actually data collection. Every detail you offer becomes a thread an officer can pull later, and if your story doesn't match a passenger's story down to the smallest detail, you've handed him a phrase that shows up in police reports across the entire country: inconsistent statements. Once you've invoked silence up front, none of that data ever gets generated in the first place, because you were never in the conversation to begin with. The third thing it stops, and this is the big one, this is the one I promised you at the top of the video, is consent creep. Here's how consent creep works. An officer, especially one who's been chatting with you for a few minutes and has built a little rapport, will often slide from casual questions into a request that sounds almost identical in tone. "You don't have anything in the car I should know about, do you? Mind if I take a quick look?" That question, delivered in the exact same friendly voice as everything before it, is not a continuation of small talk. It's a request for consent to search your vehicle, and it is fundamentally different from everything that came before it, because this is the one request that, if you say yes to it, actually costs you a constitutional protection. I need you to understand exactly what's at stake here, because this is the moment the entire structure of this video has been building toward. Under the Fourth Amendment, an officer generally needs a warrant, probable cause, or your consent to search your vehicle. Consent is the only one of those three that requires absolutely nothing from him. No evidence, no judge, no specific suspicion, just your agreement. And the moment you give it, the other two protections become irrelevant, because you voluntarily handed over the one thing the Constitution said he could never simply take from you. He doesn't have to tell you that you have the right to refuse. Courts have upheld that an officer can ask for consent while knowing full well you're allowed to say no, with no legal obligation to mention that fact to you at all. He doesn't even have to tell you you're free to go before asking. The entire request can be phrased in a tone that makes refusal feel awkward, even though refusal is completely, unambiguously within your rights. Here's why good people fall for it. The instinct is almost always the same. I have nothing to hide, so why would I say no? Saying no makes me look like I'm hiding something. That instinct is exactly what gets exploited, because people consent to searches of cars they haven't cleaned out in weeks, cars a friend borrowed over the weekend, cars with a passenger's forgotten item tucked under the seat that the driver never even knew was there. And just like that, someone who did nothing wrong is standing on the side of the road in handcuffs over an object they didn't even know existed because they said yes to a friendly-sounding question instead of understanding that yes was the single most consequential word available to them in that entire encounter. So here's the sentence for that exact moment, and I want it sitting right next to the silence sentence in your memory, because they work as a pair. Officer, I don't consent to any searches. Calm. No explanation attached. No, because I know my rights, tacked onto the end. Because justifying it just invites a debate you don't need to have on the roadside. If he pushes back with something like, well, if you've got nothing to hide, you wouldn't mind. You don't take the bait. You don't get defensive. You simply repeat the exact same line. I understand, officer, but I still don't consent to any searches. If he says he'll call out a canine unit, you let him, and your answer doesn't move an inch, because declining consent is not obstruction, it's not suspicious behavior, and it cannot lawfully be held against you. It is a citizen exercising a right that exists specifically so this decision belongs to you and not to him. Now let's talk about the piece almost nobody explains clearly, because it's the part that trips people up even after they've heard everything I just told you. The difference between what you have to do with your body and what you never have to do with your words. This distinction is the entire foundation of staying safe during any encounter with police, and I want you to lock it in permanently, because it applies far beyond just traffic stops. Physical compliance is mandatory. If an officer gives you a lawful order, hands on the wheel, step out of the vehicle, place your hands behind your back, you comply immediately, calmly, without hesitation, every single time, regardless of whether you think the order is fair or justified. This is not the moment to make a legal argument. Officers are trained to respond to hesitation and resistance as danger signals, and resisting a lawful order, even one you believe is wrong, tends to escalate the encounter and rarely changes the outcome. It just adds new charges on top of whatever the original stop was about. Your body follows every lawful instruction, full stop. Verbal compliance is a completely different category, and this is where your rights actually live. Answering questions, explaining your evening, consenting to a search. None of that is required, and all of it is entirely within your control, separate from your physical compliance. You can step out of the car exactly when told to, hands raised, completely cooperative with your body, and still calmly say, the moment it comes up, I'm remaining silent, and I don't consent to any searches. Obeying a physical order is not the same thing as giving up your right to stay quiet or your right to refuse a search. People conflate these two categories constantly, and it's exactly why they end up talking. They assume that because they have to comply physically, they must also have to comply verbally, and that assumption is simply wrong. Comply with your hands. Decline with your words. That's the whole framework, and it applies to almost every situation you could find yourself in with law enforcement, not just a traffic stop. Let's talk about what happens if the officer keeps pushing after you've invoked your rights, because this is the part that scares people the most, and understanding what's actually happening in that moment takes almost all the fear out of it. Sometimes an officer will ask again anyway, come on, I'm just trying to figure out what's going on here, help me out. This is not a sign that your invocation didn't work. It's a sign that it did, and he's testing whether you'll hold the line or fold under a little social pressure. The correct response is not to explain yourself further, not to soften your position, not to start answering just this one question to seem more cooperative. The correct response is to simply repeat the same sentence. Officer, I'm remaining silent, and I'd like to speak to an attorney. If he keeps going, you can go quiet entirely at that point, because you've already clearly invoked the risk we talked about earlier, where unexplained silence gets misread, applies specifically to silence that was never announced. Once you've said the words, going quiet afterward is protected, exactly the way it's supposed to be. Sometimes an officer will tell you that invoking your rights makes things worse for you, that cooperating now will go easier later, that only guilty people ask for lawyers. None of that is a reason to change course. It rarely makes things easier in the way it's implied to, and even in the situations where cooperation genuinely might help, that's a decision to make with an actual attorney sitting next to you, not alone on the side of a road with a flashlight in your face and a clock you can feel ticking even if you can't see it. Now let's walk through a few specific situations, because the general framework: invoke silence before answering, comply physically, never consent to a search, holds steady across almost everything, but a few scenarios have their own wrinkles worth knowing in advance. The DUI stop. This one deserves special attention because it layers a few extra rules on top of everything else. The one mandatory piece stays the same: identify yourself, hand over your documents. But field sobriety tests, the walk and turn, the one-leg stand, following a pen with your eyes, these are voluntary in most places, and you can decline them. I want to be straight with you about the trade-off here, because pretending there isn't one wouldn't be honest. Declining doesn't make the stop disappear, and an officer who already suspects impairment based on other observations can potentially arrest you anyway and request a chemical test afterward. That chemical test often falls under what's called implied consent law, meaning that simply by holding a license in that state, you've already agreed in advance to submit to it if lawfully arrested on suspicion of impairment. And refusing that specific test frequently triggers automatic penalties, like license suspension, separate entirely from the underlying charge. This is genuinely one of the more complicated corners of the law, and if you ever find yourself here for real, get an attorney involved immediately, because the fine print shifts significantly from state to state. The passenger's position. If you're a passenger rather than the driver, you're often in a stronger position than you'd expect, because you weren't the one who agreed to the conditions attached to a driver's license. In many states, a passenger isn't required to identify themselves unless there's independent suspicion connecting that specific person to criminal activity. The same silent sentence applies just as much to a passenger as a driver. If an officer starts asking a passenger about the trip, the destination, the relationship between everyone in the car, that passenger can invoke exactly the same right, exactly the same way. The knock at your front door. This one matters because your home carries stronger protection than your car does, and the rules shift accordingly. If officers knock without a warrant, you're under no obligation to open the door, and you're under no obligation to answer questions through it either. If you do open it, ask first, do you have a warrant? If the answer is no, you're not required to let them in or answer anything. If the answer is yes, ask to see it, because a valid warrant specifies exactly what can be searched and where, and anything outside those specific boundaries isn't something officers are entitled to under that warrant. Recording the encounter. In the vast majority of the country, you have a clearly established right to record police performing public duties in public, as long as you're not physically interfering with what they're doing. Being told to stop recording, or being told it's somehow illegal, doesn't change the underlying law in most places. If you choose to record, state calmly that you're doing so for your own records. Keep your phone stable, and continue complying physically with every instruction while the camera runs. Recording is documentation, it is not obstruction, and it is not resistance. Now let's tie the entire video back to the one thing we started with, because I want you leaving this with a single, clean framework you can actually use, not a scattered list of situational rules. Before you answer any question beyond confirming your identity, you invoke your right to remain silent, out loud, in plain words, calmly, and once. That single act does more to protect you than almost anything else available to you during a police encounter, because it shuts down the confession trap before it opens, it shuts down the fishing expedition before it starts, and it puts you in the strongest possible position for the moment consent to search gets requested, because you've already established, on the record, that you're not volunteering information beyond what the law actually requires. Here are the sentences one more time, back to back, so they're fresh and ready. The moment questions start beyond your identity. Officer, I'm going to remain silent, and I'd like to speak to an attorney. If a search is requested. Officer, I don't consent to any searches. If pressed on either, repeat the same sentence, calm, unchanged, no elaboration. And through all of it, your body complies with every lawful order immediately, while your words give up nothing beyond what's actually required. Say them out loud again right now, in your own voice, because the entire danger of a stop isn't the law itself. When you actually know it, the law is on your side more often than people assume. The danger is the 20 seconds of pressure, where you don't know what to say, standing there with a flashlight in your eyes and a decision to make before you've had time to think it through. Preparation is what turns those 20 seconds from a trap into a formality. Know the one thing. Say it first. Let everything else follow from there. Let's go even deeper, because there's a whole layer of situations this framework touches that most people never think through until they're standing in the middle of one, and I want you walking away from this video genuinely prepared for all of them, not just the classic traffic stop. Let's talk about checkpoints, because they work differently than a regular stop, and people often assume the same rules apply identically, when there's actually an important distinction worth understanding. Sobriety checkpoints and certain other fixed checkpoints have been upheld by courts as a limited exception to the usual requirement that police need individualized suspicion to stop you, as long as the checkpoint follows a neutral, predetermined pattern, stopping every car, or every third car, rather than officers picking and choosing who to pull aside based on a hunch. Because of that exception, you generally cannot simply refuse to stop or drive around a lawfully operated checkpoint the way you might feel entitled to with an individual stop that lacks justification. But here's what stays exactly the same once you're stopped at that checkpoint. The same framework applies from that point forward. You identify yourself, you hand over your documents, and everything beyond that remains just as optional as it would anywhere else. The checkpoint gets you stopped. It does not get an officer standing at your window any additional right to search your vehicle or interrogate you about your evening, beyond what a normal stop would allow. If you see a checkpoint ahead and there's a legal way to turn off before reaching it, a turn that exists independent of the checkpoint itself, not one you invent by cutting through a parking lot or median in a way that breaks traffic law, you're generally allowed to take it, and doing so isn't by itself suspicious or unlawful. But once you're in the checkpoint line and being waved forward, the same sentence applies the moment questions start. Identify yourself, hand over documents, and invoke your right to remain silent before answering anything else. Let's talk about being asked for your immigration status or citizenship during a stop, because this comes up more than people expect, and the rules here deserve their own careful explanation. If you're a U.S. citizen, you are not required to answer questions about your immigration status, because the question itself doesn't apply to you, and declining to engage with it isn't evidence of anything. If you're a lawful permanent resident, federal law does require you to carry your green card if you're 18 or older, but you're still not required to answer questions beyond what's necessary to identify yourself, and you can still invoke your right to remain silent regarding anything beyond your identity and immigration documents if you're asked to produce them. If immigration status becomes the actual subject of the stop rather than a passing question, this is a moment where getting an attorney involved as early as possible matters enormously, because the stakes and the specific rules around this area are more complex and more consequential than almost anything else covered in this video, and general guidance can only take you so far before the specifics of your situation genuinely need a professional looking at them directly. Let's talk about what happens if you're a minor, because parents watching this and teenagers who are newly driving both need to hear this part specifically. The framework doesn't change in its fundamentals. Identify yourself, hand over documents if you're driving, comply physically, decline verbally beyond what's required. But there are a couple of practical differences worth knowing. In many places, if a minor is taken into custody, there are additional requirements around notifying a parent or guardian, and in some states there are specific protections around how and when a minor can be questioned without a parent present. If you're a young driver and you get pulled over, the same sentence works exactly the way it would for an adult. Identify yourself, hand over your license and registration, and if questions go beyond that, say clearly that you'd like to remain silent and that you want to speak with a parent or an attorney before answering anything further. Parents, this is worth an actual conversation with your kids before they're ever in this situation, not a lecture delivered after the fact, because the version of this that sticks is the one practiced out loud in a calm kitchen, not the one explained for the first time in a panicked phone call from the side of a highway. Let's talk about what happens with body cameras and dash cameras, because this affects how you should think about the entire encounter. In most jurisdictions, officers are increasingly required to have body cameras running during stops, and that footage often becomes some of the most important evidence in any dispute that comes later about what actually happened. This matters practically in one specific way. Everything you say, including the moment you invoke your right to remain silent, is very likely being recorded already, which is exactly why saying the words clearly, calmly, and audibly matters so much. A mumbled, half-finished version of "I don't really want to" trailing off into silence, doesn't create the same clean, on-the-record invocation that a clear, complete sentence does. Speak the sentence the way you'd want it to sound, played back in a courtroom months later, because there's a real chance that's exactly where it ends up. Let's talk about what to do immediately after the stop ends, because this part gets almost no attention despite mattering enormously for anything that happens afterward. The moment you're back in your car, alone, before you even pull away, take out your phone and record a short voice memo, or write a few notes capturing everything you can remember. What time it was, what was said, in what order, what the officer looked like, his badge number, and patrol car number if you caught them, whether there was a second officer present, and roughly how long the stop took from start to finish. Memory fades fast, and details that feel unforgettable in the moment blur together within days. If anything about the stop ends up disputed later, the reason given, whether consent was actually asked for, how long you were held, your own contemporaneous notes, made minutes after the fact, become genuinely valuable, and they cost you nothing but 2 minutes sitting in your own driveway. Let's talk about what happens if you believe the stop itself was unlawful. No real reason given, or a reason that doesn't hold up. Here's the hard truth that catches people off guard. The roadside is never the place to litigate whether the stop was justified in the first place. Even if you're genuinely convinced the officer had no legitimate reason to pull you over, arguing that point in the moment accomplishes nothing except escalating the situation and potentially adding new charges to whatever you started with. The correct move is the same as everything else in this video. Comply physically, decline verbally beyond what's required, and save the argument about whether the stop itself was lawful for exactly where that argument actually gets decided, which is in front of a judge, with an attorney who can file the right motions and make the right case, months later, in a setting built for exactly that kind of dispute. This is genuinely one of the hardest instincts to override in the moment, because when you know you did nothing wrong, every part of you wants to say so immediately and loudly. Resist that instinct completely. The version of you that stays quiet and calm on the roadside and then fights it properly afterward wins far more often than the version that tries to win the argument on the shoulder of the highway with an officer who has no ability to dismiss the stop, even if he privately agreed with you. Let's talk about a scenario that trips up a surprising number of people, being asked to consent to a search of something other than your car, your phone, for instance. An officer asking to look through your phone during a stop is asking for something that generally requires a warrant, specifically because of how much personal information a phone holds, and courts have recognized phones as deserving stronger protection than almost anything else an officer might ask to search. The same rule applies here as it does to your vehicle. You are never required to hand over your phone or unlock it simply because it's requested, and declining is not suspicious, it's not obstruction, and it costs you nothing legally to say, calmly, I don't consent to a search of my phone. The same goes for bags, backpacks, purses, anything not already sitting in plain view where an officer could see it without searching at all. Plain view is a different legal category entirely. If something illegal is sitting out in the open where an officer can see it without opening anything, he generally doesn't need your consent to act on what he's already seeing. But anything closed, anything not visible from where he's standing, remains protected by exactly the same consent rule as your car, and exactly the same sentence works. I don't consent to any searches. Let's talk about what happens if an officer says he'll get a warrant if you don't consent. This is actually one of the healthiest things that can happen during a stop, even though it doesn't feel that way in the moment, because it means the decision about whether a search is justified is being handed to a judge instead of being taken by force or by pressure on the roadside. Your response doesn't change. I understand, officer. I still don't consent to a search, and I'd like to speak to an attorney. If he gets that warrant, that's the system working exactly as it's supposed to, a neutral judge deciding, based on actual evidence, whether a search is justified, rather than the decision resting entirely on whether you felt too uncomfortable to say no. There is no version of this where declining consent up front puts you in a worse position than consenting would have, because either the officer had enough for a warrant already, in which case he was getting the search regardless of what you said, or he didn't, in which case your consent was the only thing that would have made the search possible at all. Now let's talk about the single biggest mental shift this entire video is really asking you to make, because everything else is really just an application of this one idea. Most people walk into a police encounter thinking about it as a conversation, something to be handled the way you'd handle any other interaction with an authority figure. Be friendly, be forthcoming, answer what's asked, and trust that good faith on your part will be met with good faith in return. That instinct isn't wrong about most encounters in life. It's wrong specifically about this one, because a police stop isn't a conversation between two people trying to reach a shared understanding. It's a legal process with rules, stakes, and a structure that exists whether or not either person in it thinks about it that way in the moment. Once you see it as a process rather than a conversation, everything in this video stops feeling cold or distrustful and starts feeling like exactly what it is. Knowing the rules of a process you might find yourself in through no fault of your own, and making sure you're the one who understands those rules at least as well as the person standing at your window does. That's really the whole point of everything we've covered. Not distrust, not hostility, just preparation. The same kind of preparation you'd want before signing a contract, before a medical procedure, before any moment in life where the words you say and the things you agree to carry real weight afterward. You wouldn't sign a legal document without reading it first, just because the person handing it to you seemed friendly, and you shouldn't answer questions or grant consent during a stop for the same reason, no matter how warm the tone or how routine the interaction feels in the moment. Say the sentences one more time, out loud, right now, because repetition is what makes them automatic, instead of something you have to think up under pressure. Officer, I'm going to remain silent, and I'd like to speak to an attorney. Officer, I don't consent to any searches. 2 sentences. Calm, complete, unshakable, and ready the next time you need them, whether that's next week or never at all. Comply with your hands, every single time, without hesitation. Decline with your words, every single time, without apology, and leave every argument about fairness, legality, and justification for the room built specifically to decide those questions, because the roadside was never that room, and it was never supposed to be. If this filled in even one gap you didn't know you had, hit subscribe, because the next video walks through exactly what to do in the hours immediately after a stop goes wrong, what to write down, who to call first, and the mistakes people make in that first anxious hour that end up costing them far more than the stop itself ever did. Stay calm, stay prepared, and remember the one thing that actually protects you starts before you say a single word.